Welcome to week 14 of our study of the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures. And now we're going through an overview of the whole book so you can have a sense of what's going on from beginning to end. And then we'll go into the greater details. So last time when we left, we had the story of Noah in the ark, and everything is fine, and he arrives and he leaves the ark, and that's where the story picks up in Genesis chapter 9. See, everything was going good. It's just like the story of Adam and Eve. Everything started out good, and then after a time it quickly went downhill. And so it takes the same amount of time, actually faster, because it's in the same chapter that Noah is making a covenant with God. And then in chapter 9, it has the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Now, of all of those there, Canaan should be the most familiar name to you. And what happens to him becomes very important later on. These three were the sons of Noah, and from them the whole earth was populated. Now, Noah, a man of the soil, was first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and lay naked inside his tent. It may be interesting to note that this is the first reference to the consumption of alcohol. And so Noah probably had no idea of what this grape product from his vineyard was capable of doing to him. So he is an innocent here. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness, and he told his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth, however, took a robe, and holding it on their shoulders, they walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Since their faces were turned the other way, they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of the slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, let Canaan be his slave. May God expand Japheth, and may he dwell among the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." Noah lived 350 years after the flood. The whole lifetime of Noah was 950 years, and then he died. Now, you have to take into account that you have later history concerning the Canaanites, and they're not the good guys in the stories. So now we know why. It's because their father kind of embarrassed his father, Noah. Now, he saw his nakedness. What was the problem in there? And probably it goes as a reference to the practices of the Canaanites, the sexual practices. And so, see, it goes all the way back to the beginning that Canaan had, and his father had, a really immoral sexual life. And so this all comes now to fruition. Now, so it only takes them one chapter to get into this mess. Now, it gives you one explanation in terms of the Canaanites, but there are all kinds of other questions that are involved. And we're not going to go into those complicated studies of the original language of the story, which would just bog us down and bore us to no end. For now, let's just make a few points. First, the Hebrew phrase, "see his father's nakedness," suggests a much more serious offense than simply seeing Noah in his birthday suit. Second, the themes of the story are ones we have seen somewhere before. The consumption of the fruit, here grapes to wine, nakedness, shame, and curse. Reminds you, the consumption of a fruit that was good to look at, and followed by the nakedness of Adam and Eve, shame, and a curse. So we're having a second fall story. It didn't take long to go from the first fall to the second fall. And so, as we say, Noah was a new Adam. Of course, the real new Adam is Jesus, but he was a new Adam, and so therefore, once again, he fell into the same problem. And that's something that's always good for us to keep in mind, that sin has a problem of replication. It seems that no one is going to go sinless until much later in history. So sin is part of the history of humanity. Now, looking at it practically and simply, have you sinned? And if you sinned, you've continued on the history. And did you do it once, or have you done it? We won't go into that. Many times. And so sin replicates itself. Now, the story of Noah's nakedness is the fall of the new Adam. Noah gives in to a foolish indulgence, and this starts a change of events in disharmony and sin back into the human family. In other words, God cleaned out all of humanity, and now everybody's good, back to the way it was in the garden, and then Ham kind of blows it for everybody. Now, it becomes clear that the flood had not solved the problem of humanity. While all the bad people have been washed away, good people were saved in the ark. But the problem is that the line between good and bad does not run clearly between groups of people. It comes down to the center of each person. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, even Noah, as St. Paul writes in Romans. If things went downhill so quickly after the fall of Eden, they do so again in Noah's fall. In other words, don't expect things to start going uphill. No, it's taking a nosedive right away. In the next chapter, you have the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, some people say, Babel from the Babylonians, the ziggurat, because the Babylonians kept building these ziggurats, which are towers, to go to heaven. So the story is probably modeled on that. And Babylon, But before we get there, I just wanted to say that in chapter 10, to explain why you're going to need a Tower of Babel, why it's possible. The descendants of Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to whom children were born after the flood. And so you have in chapter 10 this whole list of people. And so these have become the nations, as it goes in. His kingdom originated in Babylon. From that land he went forth, etc., etc. So you have the creation of cities and of peoples. But since they're all related, then very simply, they all spoke the same language, and they could work together. So chapter 11. The whole world had the same language and the same words. While they were migrating from east, they came to a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us mold bricks and harden them with fire." They used bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we should be scattered over all the earth. Okay, first of all, notice the purpose: to make a name for themselves. This is a conceited act. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had built. Then the Lord said, "If now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that no one will understand the speech of another." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the speech of all the world. From there the Lord scattered them over all the earth. Now, as a side note, why build a tower? There are some scripture scholars that said that they wanted to get into the heavens. They wanted to get into heaven. Some felt that by going up higher, they had a better chance of having their prayers be heard. But whatever the reason is, the main reason was to make a name for themselves. Now, if they can start doing something like this because they're united, just imagine what kind of sinful concoction they can come up with next. So God went down, and catch it, come let us, plural, go down. And he confuses their tongue. And probably the origin of the story is, it's a moral story, that the fact that people said, well, why do we speak this language and other people speak another language and we don't understand each other? If Adam and Eve and Noah were all the same family, why don't we understand each other? Well, the answer is the same as it always has been: sin. In other words, these descendants of Noah conspired together to create a sin against God, and this did not come to an end, so sinning continued, and God finally said, okay, I'm going to do not so much a punishment, a preventative measure, that if you can't work together, you can't sin together. And so that may be part of God's logic. And then notice, since they're all speaking in different tongues, from Christian note, the Christians then say, well, then at Pentecost, everybody understood them in their own language. In other words, they weren't speaking in different languages, they were understood in their own language. And so you have on Pentecost the undoing of the Tower of Babel. And that's what we kind of celebrate in confirmation, of bringing everyone together in terms of a unity in one people again. Now, so much for the Tower of Babel. And, So, in the aftermath of Babel, humanity scattered, and they can't work together in disharmony. The family relationship that Noah had with God and his family is now shattered. And how can that situation be fixed? And at this point, God makes a choice that will permanently alter the flow of the river of history. He chooses one man, a certain Chaldean, which is now modern-day Iraq, from Ur of Chaldea, a person from a land that is part of present-day Iraq, named Abram. God chose this man to bring back the blessing to the rest of the human family, as it says in Genesis 12, verse 3. And I gotta go change here to Genesis 12, verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you. Now, please note, Abram is chosen not for him. He's not getting a benefit out of this. He is chosen so that he can bless the rest of the human family. You will be a blessing. And so in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. By all the families of the earth, the Bible is referring to the previous chapters, in chapter 10, which lists 70 ethnic groups that make up basic humanity. From the ancient Israelite perspective, it is important to realize that the Old Testament is a book about salvation and blessing for all human beings. Many people think the Hebrew Scriptures is a Jewish book about salvation for the Jews alone. But the whole reason the Jews are special, the whole reason that the Jews are chosen, the whole reason, in a sense, why Jesus came to the Jews is because their job is the salvation of all the world, of all people, to be a blessing to everyone that walks on the face of the earth. This has always been God's mission for Abraham's descendants. The Bible lists all the nations of the earth in Genesis 10, describes how they lost God's favor in Genesis 11, and then shows in Genesis 12 the God's plan coming together to bring everyone to salvation. And I think I have to pause here.